Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. We welcome you to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2021 Virtual Annual Conference session focusing on the state of peacebuilding in Africa, lessons learned for policymakers and practitioners. My name is Mande Muyangwa, and I am the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Africa program. And on behalf of the SVNP and the Carnegie Corporation of New York, we thank you for joining us for this very important discussion. We are live tweeting today's event and taking questions online and via email. To join us, please tweet your questions and tag us at Africa Up Close using the hashtags @Peacebuilding in Africa or @SVNP, or you can email your questions to us at africa@wilsoncenter.org. As mentioned, today's session will focus on the state of peacebuilding in Africa, lessons learned for policy makers and practitioners, a book published by the SVNP earlier this year. The State of Peacebuilding in Africa was published under the auspices of the SVNP, a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Wilson Center's Africa program to bring African knowledge, analyses, and perspectives to inform U.S., African, and international policy on peace and state building in Africa. This project, generously funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since its establishment in 2011, was born out of the belief that international peacebuilding policy is often undertaken without the consideration or input of Africans, the very people who are impacted by the policies that are often set outside of the continent. And secondly, the belief that a sustainable peace cannot be realized if it is not owned and driven by Africans. So building on the research and activities of the SVNP, The State of Peacebuilding in Africa is a book that brings together 23 authors, 6 of them members of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, and more than half of them African. But it also draws on the scholarship and experiences of international scholars and practitioners from the United States, Europe, and Australia to look back on over 30 years of peacebuilding in Africa, to examine why the challenge of rebuilding societies following conflict has not become easier over time, and to highlight some key lessons learned that could be used to build a more sustainable peace on the continent. The book is divided into 4 sections, with the first section focusing on peacebuilding in transition, the second section on strategies and tools, and the third section on regional and international dimensions of peacebuilding, while the fourth and final session covers country case studies. I would again like to take the opportunity to thank all 23 authors who contributed to the book. And thanks to the caliber of their chapters, this book is rich in lessons learned on how we can do peacebuilding more effectively in Africa. I would also like to thank my co-editor, Dr. Terence McNamee, a Wilson Center Global Fellow. In today's session, we will hear from 4 of the SVNP contributors to the book, who looked at various dimensions of peacebuilding in Africa. They are Dr. Eze, Dr. Franklin Oduro, Dr. Fritz Nganje, and Dr. Jacques. Each of them has been asked to focus their remarks on key points from their chapter, especially on the policy recommendations that they provided, as well as the key lessons learned to come out of the assessments and analysis. Each speaker will offer 6 minutes of initial remarks, and after all 4 have spoken, we will have a moderated Q&A in which we invite you, the audience, to join us and participate. As a reminder, you can tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtag at Peacebuilding in Africa or at SVNP, and also email us your questions to africa@wilsoncenter.org. So to get things started, our first speaker will be Dr. Chukwuemeka Eze. He is the Executive Director of the West Africa Network for Peacebuilding, otherwise known as WANEP, which is the largest peacebuilding network in Africa, with offices in all of the ECOWAS member states and its headquarters in Accra, Ghana. WANEP obviously is also a member of the SVNP network. Dr. Eze's chapter, co-authored with Bafo Frimpong, was on contributions of early warning to the Africa peace and security architecture, the experiences of the West Africa Network for Peacebuilding. Dr. Eze, over to you for your initial remarks.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Monde, and permit me to stand on the existing protocols that you already established, including the warm greetings that you have offered to all those joining us across the globe. Like you said, our contribution is focused on the role of civil society actors as it relates to the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, specifically looking at the UNEP's contribution to sustaining and also operationalizing the African Union Peace and Security Architecture, particularly the early warning mechanism. Now, our contribution is on the 4 key pillars of the African Union early warning system. Number 1 is that we use our network structure and over 650 member organizations across West Africa to support the data collection and the populating of the African Union continental early warning system. Based on those information provided, we are able also to support the analysis of the data in partnership with both ECOWAS and African Union. To do this in a more coordinated manner, UNEP maintains liaison offices at the African Union Commission and also at the ECOWAS Commission. At the African Union Commission since 2015 and at the ECOWAS Commission since 2003. And this has offered the much needed, if you like, civil society space to contribute to issues of peace and security on the continent, but more importantly, to influence policy makers and policy making in a manner that reflects the societal preferences. So, what are some of the key lessons that we have learned through this engagement? The first one is that we continue to notice a huge gap between early warning and early response, and the need also to institutionalize early warning systems across countries with the critical role of civil society actors. Unfortunately for the continent, it is not all the regional economic communities' early warning system that is civil society, pro-civil society. Most of them are still state-centric, but apart from the mainly the ECOWAS early warning system and to a large extent, the Egard early warning system. But we have also noticed that this lack of involvement of civil society actors, and which we reflected in the book, is a huge gap to both data collection, data analysis, communication of the report, but more importantly, responses that have in itself the participation of the citizens. The second lesson is that civil society have become critical complementing agents to the state. In the past, civil society actors were seen as opposition, but we have seen the gain to make civil society actors part and parcel of peace and security, and how that has helped to bridge the gap between the military actions and human security approaches to peace building as a critical element to the entire peace building continuum. Then, of course, that Africa's state financial contribution to peace building is still very, very low. And while we continue to tout the so-called African solution to African problems, we have not seen the commensurate contribution to the peace and security architecture of the African Union. Then, of course, how the need to strengthen local peace building mechanisms at track 3 level to now complement what takes place at both track 2 and track 3. We had 4 key recommendations. The first one is that we need to motivate and sustain the ground level elements of early warning, empowering community monitors and actors to be able to feed data into the early warning system and go beyond what we consider to be the Google conflict analysis. The second one is that there is need to ensure regular and long-term funding for early warning. The way it is now is that a lot of partners see this as investments that need quick returns. And this will not help to address the systemic and structural issues that early warning should be able to address from a preventive perspective. The next one is the need to address the gender and youth dimensions of peace building and mainstream peace education in national curricula. And where necessary, to also reflect peace education as the context-specific response mechanism, which includes, for example, the need for interfaith peace education, the need to also add to peace education issues around extremism and all the emerging issues in the continent. The next one is to enhance collaboration among civil society and regional economic communities. There is need for this experience sharing. And this we have already even started doing with the contribution ONEP is trying to make at the ICAS region. And finally, to ensure sustainable funding for civil society to contribute to peace and security across national, regional, and international level. And to be able to do this, to begin to invest in national peace architectures, empower communities, even those who are affected by the conflict, to also locate their capacities, and that how international community or third-party interlocutors should try as much as possible to strengthen these local capacities rather than replace them. Those were the key elements of the chapter that we contributed, and we will be happy to offer more perspectives during the Q&A session. I thank you. Dr. Monday, you are muted. So
I am indeed. I was just saying fantastic. You got us off to a really, really good start. And I absolutely enjoyed how you framed everything very clear to the point. And I'm sure we'll get into many of your points during the Q&A. So let me now turn to our second speaker, who is Dr. Franklin Oduro, who's the Director of Programs and also the Deputy Executive Director for the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, CDD Ghana, and a governance research and policy advocacy think tank based in Accra, Ghana. He authored a chapter on the changing nature of elections in Africa, impact on peace building. Dr. Oduro, your 6 minutes start now, my brother. Sorry, you're muted.
But
okay, we hear you.
Hello.
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah. So my chapter essentially looked at the elections as a tool for peace building on the continent in terms of the contributions of using elections to peace building. And essentially, I looked at 30 years, close to 3 decades of elections, the conduct of elections, the use of elections as a peace building mechanism on the continent. And the argument, the central argument that I make in that book is that, yes, it is true that elections contribute critically in peace building, and various peace building efforts in some of the countries that we've witnessed have actually utilized the power of elections in resolving conflicts. But at the same time, I make the argument that in order for elections to be such a powerful tool, we need to be mindful of the inclusiveness of the electoral process. We need to be mindful of the integrity of the processes and also the credibility of outcomes. Without that, we still have a challenge, a problem with using election as a peace building tool in the menu of the peace building tool that we have. And in doing that, looking at 3 decades of elections in relation to peace building efforts, I try to highlight some challenges, recurrent challenges and new threats in which the use of elections as a tool, peace building mechanism can be impacted negatively if we don't look at that. And the first thing that I look at is the fact that our electoral systems, our governance architecture in many of the countries continue to endanger winner-takes-all politics. And such winner-takes-all politics sort of closes doors to opposition, especially opposition candidates and people who want to use the electoral platform to resolve conflict, but also to seek power. And the fact that this system remains, it creates polarized electoral processes, and it sort of raises the stakes to elections to a level that can really trigger conflict and return countries to destabilization. The second point that comes to what I look is the question of sequencing and timing. When do we use election as a tool to really promote peace building? This is an old subject, but it still remains powerful. A challenge in the tool that we use. I think some of you who have been following cases in Ethiopia will agree with me that the issue of timing, sequencing, when do you use election, became one of the issues that confronted the recent elections that took place. The third challenge, quickly, is the fact that technology has become a tool in enhancing the transparency of the electoral processes. It still remains a threat to election peace, especially when it comes to the area of resource tabulation, collation, and announcement. The opacity in that particular aspect of technology can trigger peace, can trigger destabilization. And we saw that in many countries recently. Kenya was one example, and even Ghana, if you go back to 2012 elections, we can talk about that. And then a couple of points, I know my time is running, that I also highlighted is the fact that the misuse and abuse of presidential term limits, using constitutional or political processes, actually forecloses doors to opposition parties, candidates, and that actually also can undermine peace building. We are seeing that in Guinea. We saw a threat that it poses in Cote d'Ivoire. Of course, we've seen that in Uganda recently. And I think that aspect of manipulation of the laws and presidential term limits is also a threat that remains continues to be a threat. And the final point that I'll highlight before I go to recommendation is the fact that I think we have to be mindful of the increasing cost of elections in terms of the conduct of the election administration in general, but more importantly, when it comes to campaign financing, which actually has a potential to limit in a situation where you also have an incumbent abusing an incumbent advantage, has the limit to create spaces which are fair and equal to everybody to compete fairly and win elections. And that also presents a threat. And so in looking at some of these recurrent and emerging threats, I conclude by offering a couple of recommendations for policymakers, especially the United States government, international democracy agencies to look at. And one of them that I think is very critical is the need for us to revisit some of the electoral regulations that countries are embarking on, are using to conduct elections, which have not been updated since democratization, the transition to democracy in the early 90s. Especially, how do we reform these laws to make them consistent to the African Union, ECOWAS, peace infrastructures that actually allow for inclusive electoral processes. So I think it's important for us to support efforts of countries to reform these electoral regulations. The second recommendation is to support civil society, regional and sub-regional efforts to counter the growing menace of abuse of term limits in terms of how countries are using the systems of democracy, institutions of democracy, to misuse and abuse term limits, which presents a great danger in many of the countries that we need to work. So I'm recommending a strong support for sustainable support for civil society, for ECOWAS, regional sub-region, really institutionalized term limits, but of course was resisted by two small countries, Togo and Gambia. And I think we need to revisit that. And part of that effort is support civil society to embark on sustained advocacy for this to happen. And the third recommendation that I make is the need for civil society, domestic observer groups, supporters of democracy to really look at how elections, the use of technology to promote transparent elections can be enhanced in a way that we find tools and protocols to close off the gaps that create suspicion in technology use and in administrating elections. And I think there's room for more enhanced capacity for several groups, both local and international groups, in terms of procurement, software procurement, all of those things. How do we expand the discourse around that to make the use of technology more responsive and more transparent, and to avoid suspicion and to trigger conflict? And finally, I make the point, a recommendation that we need to begin to have a conversation around campaign financing. We need to have a conversation around how do we create space for sustainable election financing. We still have countries on the continent where a majority of funding of organizing elections come from external sources. How do we create local ownership, local sources to make election a little bit cheaper? And that has to do with issues around procurement, issues around creating a fair level playing field for all contestants to play, but more importantly, regulating campaign rules and finance to make it more inclusive for women, youth, and other marginalized populations to be able to participate. And I think if we have all of this in an environment that creates inclusive election process, we can still continue to use election to promote peace building rather than using election to actually trigger or destabilize peace that we are still trying to sustain. So let me pause here and I can expand on some of those issues during the Q&A. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Oduro, that was a fantastic look at elections. Again, continuing on this really good trajectory of just going directly to the core points, just like Dr. Eze did in talking about the early warning aspects of peace building. So really setting us up for a great discussion, I think, today. Let me now turn it over to our next speaker, who's going to be Dr. Fritz Nganje. He is an associate professor at the University of Johannesburg's Department of Politics and International Relations, and also a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, focusing on conflict, peace, and security in Africa, South-South cooperation, and the diplomacy of subnational governments. Dr. Nganje's chapter was on local peace committees and grassroots peace building in Africa. Over to you, Dr. Nganje.
Thank you, Monde, and thanks to all those who joined today's session. I'll try to make good use of my 6 minutes. So as Monde has pointed out, my chapter looked at the role of local peace committees as mechanisms for grassroots peace building over the past 30 years on the continent. And I think what I'll try to do here is to focus on three aspects of the chapter. Firstly, to highlight what I consider to be the main finding of the chapter, identify 2 key lessons as well as the recommendations that I put forth in the chapter. And I think I should start by saying that the history of local peace committees as mechanisms for grassroots peace building in Africa essentially highlights the tension that has always been there between the so-called bottom-up and top-down approaches to peace building on the continent. And you see this playing out in different dimensions of the work of local peace committees over the past 3 decades on the continent. And I think the first area that I want to highlight where you see this tension evident is in terms of whether these structures should be formalized or not, and what should be the appropriate relationship between local peace committees as grassroots structures and the formal institutions and processes of the state. This poses some kind of a challenge because essentially the value proposition of local peace committees stems from their informality and the dynamism that flows from that informality. But on the other hand, these structures, they also need to draw legitimacy from their association with the formal structures of the state, as well as the support that will come from the formal institutions of the state. And on the other hand, you do realize that local peace committees most often tend to rely more on traditional mechanisms of peace building. And sometimes these mechanisms can complement the official processes of the modern state, but at other times they can actually run into conflict with the modern state processes of justice. So you find that in countries like Kenya, where some of the approaches preferred by local peace committees have actually run counter to the formal justice system. Another challenge or another area where you see the tension between local peace committees and the top-down approaches to peace building has to do with the fact that these structures, while they are embedded in local processes, and that is what gives them their greatest strength, on the other hand, because they are rooted in these local processes and dynamics, that in itself can undermine the kind of peace that they can create. Because sometimes, rather than work to transform local dynamics that are oppressive and breed conflict, they are forced to work within this same process and as such reinforce oppression rather than try to work to transform some of those sources of conflict. And importantly, there is also the tension that arises from the fact of whether these structures should draw support from outside the local communities in which they're embedded, or they should focus exclusively on their own resources. But see, on the one hand, they work better when they are independent and they rely on their own local resources and processes. On the other hand, if you look at the history of these structures of the continent, they have been able to engage in sustainable peace building only when they have been supported financially and technically by NGOs and donors from outside the local communities. So from this review, I identified two key lessons that I think we can take out of the activities of local peace committees and which could be used to actually strengthen the activities of these structures. The first is that the principle of local ownership and agency that is at the heart of the work of local peace committees is actually a necessary requirement for peace building, but it cannot be a sufficient requirement. This is primarily because while local peace committees actually, or the local environment can actually be a catalyst for sustainable peace building, it can also be a terrain which actually reinforces and gives rise to conflict dynamics. So we cannot take the local environment to be a panacea for peace building. We need to be critical and look at how the local context can contribute to peace building, but it can also be the source of conflict and violence. And which means, and this takes me to the second lesson, which is that in order for local peace committees to be effective in their contribution to peace building, they need to be conceived as part of a broader framework of peace building that cuts across the local, the national, the regional, and the international dimension. Otherwise, local peace committees would not have the capacity to be able to deal with the complexity of conflicts that they are called upon to mediate. And what are some of the recommendations that I put forth? The first is that I think African governments need to put in place a good legal and policy framework that could support the work of local peace committees as grassroots structures for peace building. Because my observation is that when these structures actually work within a formalized framework, they are able to draw legitimacy and support from the formal processes of the state, but they can also bring in their dynamism because they are rooted in local processes and local dynamics. And importantly, one of the recommendations I put forth is that institutions like the UN and the AU, when they conceive future peacebuilding missions, they may want to consider bringing in a local dimension to bring in local peace committees as components to this mission so that they can contribute in actually localizing whatever peace processes that the formal missions have been mandated to pursue. And in terms of the kind of support that external donors can bring to the work of local peace committees, I think rather than emphasizing financial support as we often see, and which can sometimes undermine the independence and the efficiency of these institutions, I think there can be a framework that can be created where learning can be supported among different local peace committees in different countries across the continent. That could be a good way to support them to draw lessons from one another and ensure that they are not left on their own, but also they are the external support does not interfere with their independence and how they can harness the local dynamics to strengthen their peace building role. I think I'll end here and then I'll engage with the Q&A session. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Nganje, I'm loving this panel already. You all are doing such a fantastic job. So looking at local peace committee and sort of how we can best tap into these local peace committees to support the larger peace building goals initiatives. So, you know, really continuing an important discussion about local ownership of peace, if it's to succeed, and how you build it into these peace building missions that we have. So let me now turn to our last speaker, Dr. Jacques Maddox. He is a professor of anthropology at Syracuse University in New York, and also the former executive director of the Sud Institute, which is a public policy research center based in Juba, South Sudan, that is also a member of the SVNP network. Dr. Jacques' chapter was on lessons in failure, peace building in Sudan and South Sudan. Over to you, Dr. Jacques. Your 6 minutes start now, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ari. Thanks to all the other panelists. I have enjoyed the presentations. I'm most particularly pleased to hear Dr. Nganje talk about local peace committees, because some of what I'm saying is probably a repeat of that, but that means really there is a meeting of minds that are similar findings being brought forth from across the African continent. So a repetition of this sort is not a waste. It's a lesson that we can share all across the African continent, at least in south of the Sahara. My main question emerging from that chapter is what makes efforts to make peace, to build peace, and to sustain peace so difficult to bear fruits? And I have two main answers to that question, which I will highlight. There are more, but I will just focus on these two. The first one is the nature of the conflict itself, where in some African conflicts, there is multi-layeredness to the conflicts. There is a lot of fracturing, such that the lines of confrontations are not clear. Even within an opposition, you will find that there are multiple layers of the opposition where they fight among each other as well. So that when you try to reconcile or reach a settlement, it's not very clear who are the main actors. Who do you include? Who do you exclude? What are the costs of excluding or including? There is a lot of factionalization even within one entity. And as a result, you find that there is a two-way flow of the conflict. The national level conflict, such as the war in South Sudan between main contenders, or the war in Sudan between three regions to the south of the Republic of Sudan and the central government, there is a two-way flow of that conflict where the local level conflicts feed into the national one, and the national conflict also feeds into the local layers of conflict. And that makes it extremely difficult to bring about a lasting settlement when the parties themselves are not in agreement. The second, I mean, the parties within one faction are not in agreement on what they want or what the platform for their discussion is. The second is there is a disconnect between the national level conflict and the various levels at the communal level. For example, so you have the main warring parties in Sudan and South Sudan, but then the impact of those conflicts at the national level is such that various communities are also warring among themselves over sometimes mundane but equally important livelihood issues, competition over diminishing resources, the issue of land, the issue of water, the grazing fields, and so forth. And so when we are making peace, there is tendency to focus more on the national level conflict, which impact at the local level, but the local level is now not brought to the same level when we are making peace or trying to build peace or sustaining peace. There is tendency to focus too much on power sharing at the national level between the main contenders, and less attention to local dynamics that are just as damaging to human security as the civil war at the national level. And usually the settlements that are reached tend to focus on distributing power and resources at the national level. And then we say there has been a peace agreement, and the peace agreement does not translate effectively into the lives of everyday people whose lives have been wrecked by level conflicts. There is also the idea that justice, when you're making peace, justice is very important. So the question that has always confronted Sudanese and South Sudanese, for example, is whether justice should come first or silencing the guns should come first. And the tendency is to really make so much about accountability for certain misdeeds that have taken place during the war. While that is an important one, focusing too much ahead of the actual silencing of the guns and settlement seems to me to be putting the cart before the horse. And it has plagued many conflicts, including Liberians at one point had to relinquish this idea of justice first and simply give blanket amnesty. I'm not saying this should be done across the board, but there is always a need for us to pay close attention to whether we should really peg justice to a political settlement first, or whether we should find ways to do these two things concurrently. It doesn't have to be a matter of either or. It doesn't have to be either peace or justice. They can be done concurrently. And depending on the context, the tendency has been to put justice so prominently ahead of any kind of political settlement. And that has derailed many peace agreements and many peace deals. Now, what should we do in this regard? I think we support the local level peace building initiatives that are independently initiated by local people themselves, such that it is not to stop the national peace level, but to say that while the national level conflict is still so difficult and protracted, and it's not going to be easily resolved, there is no reason why local people themselves cannot find their own mechanisms locally to allow for everyday lives to go ahead. But to say that the communities cannot be kept hostage to the whims of their elite at the national level, that they should wait for their leaders at the national level to find compromise among themselves and then and then pay attention to what the local people themselves are doing, just so that their lives can carry on day to day. So, for example, there is no reason why women in a village cannot continue to travel across the valley to sell their farm produce, even amidst the intense national conflict. There is no reason why school children cannot continue to attend school across warring lines. But if you build those dialogue initiatives and communication that is going on at the national level, so that at least they are able to find mechanisms to reach a certain level of compromise, such that these daily needs continue, even in the absence of overall peace and peace building at the national level. I think the situation in Unity State, for example, in Bahar Ghazal, in Upper Nile, as I have delineated in the chapter, speak volumes about the need for these local initiatives to carry on, even as we search for a national level peace building. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input on, again, I see going down to the local level and building peace from the bottom up, rather than this tendency that we have of focusing at the very top of the peace building actors and participants. So really great presentations from all four of our speakers. And before we start the Q&A, let me remind our online audience that you can tweet your questions and tag Africa Up Close using the hashtags @PeacebuildingInAfrica or @SVNP, or you can also email your questions to us to africa@wilsoncenter.org. So let me now just turn to the questions. We have a few that have come in, so please keep them coming. The first question is really to all of you, and I'll ask that we take this in the order in which you spoke. I'll give you a couple of minutes if you want to weigh in on this question. It is that the book presents a rich set of lessons learned and best practices from an African context to offer policymakers and practitioners. How can the expertise and lessons be better highlighted and incorporated into global governance institutions, where African contributions and institutions are often marginalized? So let me start with you, Dr. Eze.
Thank you very much. I think that one of the ways to do that is exactly what the SVNP is doing, but which we can deepen and consider the continuous engagement of policymakers, this kind of engagement between we as practitioners from Africa and policymakers from the West. And in doing that, I think that in recent time, what I've noticed working in this area in the past more than 2 decades is that there are some development partners that actually their definition of local partners is not in terms of location. It's actually a bit demeaning to regard anybody who is in the global south as not having the capacity. And I have always argued that for the mere fact that we as Africans even experience this conflict already makes us experts. And we have seen that where these local capacities are ignored, the costs on response is usually very, very high. And that's why today we are changing the engagement procedure between ONEP as an institution and other organizations and asking the critical questions. What is the comparative advantage? So in my opinion, it is important to expand this kind of SVN platform to continuously, rather than just focus on what we are doing through this kind of publication, for example, how do we expand our engagements to include this kind of interaction with policymakers, whether it is at the level of intergovernmental organizations or at multilateral or bilateral levels, whether it is between the US and African scholars, a situation where we can engage and we understand the policy direction of the US government, for example, then they also hear the perspectives of us as not just experts from Africa, but also practitioners that connect with the local realities and the peculiarities of Africa. The second thing, of course, is that in the past, it was difficult for practitioners to have time to write. I think that what SVNP, for example, brings on board is a combination of these different actors: practitioners, academia, think tank, researchers, and so on and so forth. So how do we leverage on the strength of each other? I find it very difficult sometimes to write, and yet there is so much to talk about based on experiences we continue to gather from the field. So how do we, expand the SVNP actors to bring in more people who are into research and the academia, so they can also be given the experiences from the field to write, and that way the key perspectives of Africans can now have influence in decision making.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Franklin, let me turn to you with the same question. Do you have a take on that?
I wouldn't depart significantly from Dr. Eze. I think he sort of nailed it down on that part. But I would just add one point that, and perhaps let me quote from the Holy Bible, that they say a prophet is not recognized in his or her home, and I think that's the challenge that we face. So all the work that all of us are doing, one job, for all of us, the SVNP collect, and even outside of this network, how are our policymakers, our governmental leaders, our sub-regional leaders, African Union, the ECOWAS, and others, how are we incorporating these ideas? How are we building, and sustaining a crop of practitioners that bring into this discourse lessons learned based on what we do at the local level and even at the national level. So I wonder, for instance, how much has the Department of Political Affairs at African Union taken this publication, looked at it and dissected it, and tried to identify practitioners who have sort of put this information together to share less. And I think we need to do more. And so I agree with Dr. Eze that capacity needs to be unearthed, needs to be exposed, and need to be continuously engaged at the sub-regional level or maybe across sub-regional level, but also have our international partners to recognize that there is that local capacity to work with, to deepen this engagement.
Wanda, you are muted.
I am muted. I'm going to get this right eventually. Saying thank you so much, Franklin. Fritz, do you have anything to add to what Dr. Eze and Oduro have already mentioned on this particular issue?
Yes, look, I do agree that there is a lot that needs to be done. And I think I agree more with Franklin that charity begins at home. And that even before we start making efforts to ensure that these insights, are fed into global institutions and other actors involved in peace building in Africa, I think the first responsibility is how to use these insights that have been generated to strengthen and harness these capacities on the continent, to the point where when these efforts that we are talking about, when they start bearing fruits, they cannot go unrecognized. So I think before we start going to knock doors at the UN and other foreign institutions, we should look at how do we harness these efforts and these capacities at the local, the national, and the regional level on the continent, so that we can use that as a platform to engage, not just through, not just at the level of the rhetoric, but to show that this is what is happening in South Sudan. This is what happened in this community. This is how this community was able to transform a particular conflict situation. And if we build on this, it will not only strengthen the efforts of the AU or the Sudanese government, but this particular approach could be harnessed to build peace in other parts of the world. And that is how we then shape global discourse and processes. So I think we need to start on the continent and develop the capacity and develop the institutions that will then be taken seriously, on the basis of which we can start seeking to influence global debates.
Thank you so much for that, Fritz. And I'll come back to it, because what I'm getting is slightly different from you. I think what Dr. Eze is saying, or at least what I'm getting from all of you, is that you need to approach this at both the international level. We know what needs to be done, but those two things are not mutually exclusive in terms of making sure that the international community is aware and engages with these key lessons learned that are coming from Africans. But you're also saying, we also need to do the same at home on the continent, but probably emphasize that a little bit more in the beginning. So I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive, but I get your point. Absolutely. Let me turn to you, Jacques. Do you have anything to add to this question? And then I'll get to the next question. So thank you so much to the three previous speakers on that.
Yeah, only to give an example about how this is already being done. What the question is asking is already at play. And the example I give is the observation that we have made concertedly in East Africa, that this issue of justice is really, even though it is needed, it's drailing the efforts to reconcile the warring parties, to bring peace to the country, and therefore we have to find another way and to relax the pressure on the parties regarding justice, because obviously they are not going to sign a peace agreement that puts their necks on the guillotine, and so it's not to give up on it. So as a result of this pressure, you see that last week the African Union really brought a concerted effort to the U.S. State Department to relax the pressure on this issue called transitional justice and the creation of the hybrid court for South Sudan. For example, there was a part of the peace agreement was to create a hybrid court on the atrocities that took place during the 5-year war in South Sudan. Now, the U.S. State Department, the African Union, and regional organizations like EAC are saying, okay, if this issue of the hybrid court is causing a delay in implementing key parts of the peace agreement, such as security reforms, and such as making a timeline for the constitutional review and a timeline for integration of the forces and for a schedule on elections, then let us relax it a little bit and append it to progress made in all these other areas. And I think this is going to and it is a result of such efforts, as was raised in the question and as the other speakers have spoken to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for bringing that practical example. Before I move on to the next question, I don't want to lose a couple of things that have come out of your responses to this question. And I want to emphasize them, and I'm probably going to frame them slightly different. I think one of the key messages that I got from Dr. Eze's response to the question is that, capacity building in Africa has become a business, right? In terms of that international space. So if you say you're doing capacity building in Africa, you get the resources that you need to go there. But I think let's not lose sight of what Dr. Eze just said, which is that oftentimes this capacity building does not recognize the capacities that already exist. And so before you go talking about capacity building, particularly for international partners and others, take stock of what already exists in the field in which you're going. See if you can join forces, see if you can amplify those forces. those elements, those capacities, before you start talking about we're going in to build the capacity of Africans. The experience that we've already heard just from the four of you here today, I think demonstrates that. I think that the other question that we heard is really about doing more in terms of having Africans themselves recognize the capacity that exists at home. I think that came through very, very clearly. And in speaking with a number of you, you hear often people who are running up and taking on international partners to come and do something in this space and other spaces while ignoring that capacity that exists at home. I think those are two key messages that I am getting from the both of you, that we really need to revisit, sorry, all of you, that we really need to revisit that. Let me take a couple of questions that have come through. The first question is from Dr. Thompson. And this one goes to Dr. Oduro. It is about what role can civil society play in ensuring that incumbency power is not used to skew the elections in favor of the ruling party, particularly when the ruling party uses state resources like police to depress opposition party campaigns. I'll take a second question and put it out there for the others to think about. This is from Gustavo at ISS, and he says, all of us in the peace building field tend to repeat the mantra that it is a long-term process, but we still often design responses, approaches, and strategies that follow almost a programmatic cycle of 3 to 4 years. How can we move beyond this pervasive cycle that conceptually seems to be going in the right direction, but in practice, we seem to still be stuck in developing short-term responses? So let me start with Dr. Oduro with the question that was directed to you, and then I'm going to come to Jacques, Fritz, and Dr. Eze to respond to any one of the two questions, add to it. Just pick one of the two to add to it, and then I'll move on to another question. So Franklin, why don't you kick us off on this question?
Thank you, Monday, and thank you, Dr. Thompson, I believe. I think essentially the question of the role of civil society in addressing incumbent advantage, which is a recurring issue, which is something that is very important if we want to ensure a fair playing field. We normally talk of elections and how elections are credible in the language of it's free and it's fair and it's credible. The fair part is what we continue to grapple. It's a problem we continue to grapple with. One of the ways that civil society can do to address that is I think I made reference to my initial remarks, is the sustainability of the advocacy around reforming the rules and laws. The African Union own charter on democracy, election, governance forbid that. Our various constitutions in some of our countries forbid that. And yet, every election cycle, we come back to talk about incumbent advantage. And we present a lot of recommendations for reforming the electoral rules around that. And we never come back to that until the next 4 years or 5 years when the issue raises its ugly head again. So I think civil society can begin to do advocacy in a more sustainable manner in between elections. We don't have to wait until the next election cycle that we raise this issue. That's one of the things that I think is lacking in many of our countries. We sort of move from one issue to another. And once election is over, we don't come back to reflect on what were the lessons learned. How do we make it better? There are quite good examples on avoiding incumbent advantage on the continent. Quebec has one good example where I believe in 3 months or 6 months to elections, the prime minister or the president hands over, to a caretaker government, and then if he's competing, competes with all other people. Why are we not drawing these lessons from the continent? How few countries, some countries are doing better to inform how we can engage and reform our various countries. So I think the long and short of my answer is that we need a sustainable advocacy around that, not episodic advocacy of reforming, but a more sustainable in between elections, so that these reforms, and drawing from the African Union peace build infrastructure, protocols on elections, the ECOWAS protocols, other sovereign protocols, we can, demand for reform because all of our member countries are signatories to all of these charters and protocols. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franklin. Fritz, can you take any one of the questions, or is it Jacques? Actually, I think it was Jacques first. Jacques and then Fritz. Take one of the two questions, and then we'll round it out with Dr. Eze. Jacques, over to you.
Okay, I was muted. So one question, 1 minute on each. On elections, even if an election cycle has been developed and sustained in a given country, what we realize is that the minute elections are over, the government, instead of deliver on the messages of their election, they start campaigning. So they spend the next several years until the next election campaigning. So if that is the case, why should civil society not be also working during that period to ensure that people deliver on the messages, but not just spend time in the cycle of electioneering? And I think there is something that can be, the Africans can offer, a lesson that they can offer in this regard, such that Africans themselves become very, very, very key in monitoring elections. Because the tendency has been that outside experts come to vouch for elections that the Africans themselves have declared to be not clean and not transparent. And yet the outsiders will vouch for them so quickly, to the point where some African leaders have now begun to hire communication experts from outside to monitor and declare elections to be fair and free. So there has to be a focus on Africans themselves to monitor elections, and that can only happen if they sustain that monitoring of the political situation between elections. On the issue of short-term projects on what is essentially a long-term quest, I think that the dilemma is very clear between working with the long-term ideas in order for the product of that peace process to be sustained, and then the need to end violence in the immediate sense. So it is a question of keeping those two things in mind, that of course the need to end conflict is immediate and requires immediate actions, but keeping in mind that once you have reached a certain level of compromise, you must think long-term now going forward. So I think the dilemma is what is causing this apparent disconnect between what we say as a long-term process and what we do in the short term in terms of bringing peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacques. Dr. Eze, any thoughts on either one of the two questions?
No, I think I'll rather leave issues around the election to those who understand it better than I do. And Frank, that's what he sleeps and eats. So let me focus on Gustavo's question. I think the first thing to appreciate is why most civil society actors do what they do. The issue of funding will always come to mind, okay? And most civil society organizations is not for lack of knowledge of the need for this long-term planning, but how do you sustain such long-term planning? How do you fund the long-term planning? At the end of the day, you are going to rely mostly on international donors who probably have other interests, including what, like I said earlier on, immediate harvest, which is results. So, and in that case, you must design your strategy in such a way that it responds to their need. The second thing also is that most of the peace building activities are seen as something outside of national development strategy. So I also see a gap between what civil society organizations are doing and what the state is doing, and how the state does not see peace building as part and parcel of development agenda. But I think there is also hope. Number one is that institutions like African Union and most regional economic communities, giving example of ECOWAS, are designing long-term vision. So what we have done, and the experience I want to share in UNEP, is that we took a decision that we are moving away from a program-driven organization to a vision-driven organization. And therefore, partners should invest in the vision of UNEP. And that became easy for us because even ECOWAS, as at that time, they were talking about Vision 2020. Now we are trying together with ECOWAS to design Vision 2050. African Union is talking about Vision 2063. So I think that that creates enough impetus and justification for us as civil society organizations to also have our own long-term strategy along these visions. However, we can now cut it down through our strategic plan. There are people that do 3-year strategic plan cycle. UNEP does a 5-year strategic plan cycle. So, but in doing that, let us speak to the long-term vision of either 2063, or depending on your regional economic community or the national context you operate from, that same national development agenda. How does it speak to that? And once you key into that, my conviction and my experience having done this in UNEP is that partners now align themselves and their support in that direction.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Eze. We have 2 more questions. I'm going to read them out, and I would like each of you to pick one and spend about a minute or 2 responding to the question of your choice, and then we'll go from there. So let me just get to the right point here in the document. Just give me a second, please. So the first question is from Ni Akwete, and his question is, will Dr. Oduro and colleagues agree or disagree? Should African political parties be publicly funded and then have the financial records publicly audited and otherwise scrutinized? So that is question number 1. The second question is from Ms. Helen Kezinoa, and it's directed to any of the speakers. And her question is a much broader one, which is, how do we decolonize peace-building knowledge in Africa? A general but really, really important question. And so with that, let me turn it back over to you. And this time I will start with, who shall I start with? Who wants to go first?
Let me go first, since I didn't respond in the first round. Can I just take a second, wanted to speak to Gustavo's question? I think you missed me earlier. I'm
sorry about that. I'm not doing it. I need more coffee. Please go ahead.
Gustavo, I think when you see the dilemma between long-term and short-term approaches to peace building also touches at the heart of what kind of peace, I think Jacques touched on that. What kind of peace are we attempting to build, and whose peace are we building? Who are we, whose interests are we putting at the heart of the peace building process? Because I think George touched on an important point, that if we are focusing on the interests of the elite to strike deals and reach compromise, then it becomes easier to focus on short-term strategies and cycles. But if we take seriously the interests of the grassroots people on the ground, to say it's supposed to be a peace that deals with what the experiences of the people are, then we will put the people at the center of our peace building efforts. And if we do that, that also means that we will be ready to engage in the messy process of ensuring that peace building itself becomes interwoven with the broader processes in society to transform society and deal with some of the vexing socioeconomic challenges that societies face. And I think if you adopt that approach to peace building, then you cannot run away from a long-term approach in order to try to build a peace in a particular society. But most often we get caught up in this short-term approach because the focus seems to be more on the interest of the elite or the political figures. Peace is conceived from that perspective, overlooking what are the interests and the concerns of the people on the ground. And with regard to the question on political party funding, I think I will agree that that could be a good way to go, that if you want transparency and accountability, then the public should take that responsibility to provide the funds that political parties, if we recognize that they play an important role in our politics and our governance processes, then the public should take that responsibility, because you cannot go asking for accountability and transparency when you don't want to take that responsibility to provide the resources that may be needed to carry out that work. So one way to actually ensure that there is accountability and transparency is for the public to take on that responsibility to provide funding. And in that way, it becomes difficult for political parties to actually run away from disclosing their books, for them to be scrutinized to see where the money comes from and what ties actually come with that funding.
Thank you so much, Fritz. Let me go to Franklin, and then I will come to Jacques, and then I'll ask Dr. Eze to bring us home on one of these, either one of the two questions.
Yeah, so I'll take Ni Akwete's question. Hi, Ni, long time. I don't think it's as simple as agreeing or disagreeing with public financing of political parties. I think the fundamental point is that political parties need to be financed to be able to engage. The challenge is that how do you do it? And for me, if we don't address the issue of incumbency advantage, which and earlier I think Dr. Thompson asked, even if we provide state financing to political parties, there will still be an imbalance because the incumbent will still take advantage of the being in office to do more than the parties that are already in there. So I think we need to look at it in a more holistic manner and not just saying that whether the state should finance political parties or not. And I'll go a step further, that I don't think that it's only when public financing goes to political parties that we demand transparency and accountability from political parties. Even if they seek private funding, because they seek to govern the country, they need to be transparent, the source of their financing, how they are accountable to.
I think we lost Franklin. So I'll wait for him to come back and I'll allow him to finish his thought. He's frozen on my screen. So let me go to you, Jacques.
Thank you, Doc. So I think the two questions are linked somewhat. The issue of decolonizing peacebuilding knowledge and the issue of financing political parties, public financing of political parties. And the link there is, depending on which country you are focusing on, you will find that a lot of all colonial, all political parties that work to decolonize their countries, whether you're talking about CCM in Tanzania or ANC in South Africa or SPLM in South Sudan, a lot of them have this sense of entitlement that allow them to fund themselves from public coffers. And in doing so, sustain their presence in office time after time. And so decolonizing peacebuilding is really an essence of Africans themselves liberating themselves from the liberators. And so, and until they have done this, the fact that these political parties have fought for the decolonization of their countries give them that sense of entitlement to continue to do it. So I think there is a great deal of work that needs to be done about these all political parties, even when they have produced different iterations of themselves, such as the situation in Kenya, where KANU controlled the place for a long time following decolonization, but then transform itself into a different name, but actually inherently remaining the same. So I think there is a link there that can be probed a bit further.
Thank you so much, Jacques. Franklin, I see you were able to rejoin us. Do you want to just quickly finish your thought? I know you are on phone, but if you can just quickly finish your thought, and then I will turn it over to Dr. Eze. Franklin, I see you. Can you hear me? There you are. I was saying, can you just quickly finish your thought in a minute, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Eze. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes.
Sure. I'm sorry, my battery ran down. I was just trying to say that I think, whatever we need to do in strengthening political parties to be able to compete fairly is critical. But it's not as simple as state financing or public financing of political parties. Yes, I think it's a good idea, but we need to do it in a more holistic way in which transparency and accountability and fairness, and also preventing incumbents from taking advantage of power, including the use of state resources, police and security agencies. But I think it's a very sensitive topic in many countries in Africa, especially when countries are still confronted with poverty and trying to provide for all, when we also don't see how many don't see how political parties are contributing in protecting the public purse and reducing corruption in the various countries. And so people get angry when the whole idea of public financing of parties come to play. But I think we need to have a bigger conversation why it's important to finance political parties, but in a more transparent and a more equitable way, and also linked that financing to inclusiveness of marginalized communities, like women participation in leadership of parties and contestation, the youth, and other communities. So that's what I'm going to say to Nia Kwete, that it's much bigger than just agreeing or disagreeing with you on that.
Thank you so much, Franklin. We appreciate really your efforts to rejoin the conversation. Dr. Eze, can you bring us home on either one of the two questions that you will pick?
Yeah, I'll rather respond to the issue around the colonization of peace building. And I think it is important to also understand peace building within the broader context of the relationship that exists between Africa and the states that colonized them in the past. So neocolonialism is part of peace building continuum, and it is not going to change anytime soon. So the truth of the matter is that in my previous life as a political scientist, one of the things that I've argued is that the modern states in Africa, the states bequeathed to Africa by the colonialists, we are not meant to succeed. If you look at the character and nature of the states, the configuration and the structure of the state, you then ask yourself whether these states were actually supposed to even play a very indigenous role. So how many of the states in Africa organically developed that respond and reflect the wishes of the citizens? So it is within that context also that peace building is taking place. And also remember that a huge chunk of issues around peace and security in Africa is interest-based. They are externally teleguided, whether from the sale of arms and ammunition, from the taking advantage of the natural resources and minerals in Africa. The issue of colonized spaces for peace building will continue for as long as this neo-colonialism continue, and that's tragic, and that's my opinion. Now I've spoken like a political scientist, not a peace building.
That's a powerful way for us to conclude. I think just the question and answer portion of this, because of a couple of more things to get through. But really my biggest thing is to thank my 4 SVNP brothers for a fantastic job. First, for your contributions, and a really fantastic job of just highlighting some of the richness that you all brought to this SVNP book. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. I've enjoyed this discussion with all of you. The second thing is for the audience that's out there, you see that today SVNP was ably and in a very effective way represented by our brothers. So you may be wondering, where are the women? Were they excluded from this book? No, they were not. It just so happens that the SVNP portions of the book were by male authors. I think that's great. We have 6 authors, female authors, who contributed to the book as well. I was going to do a quick summary of the key lessons learned, the key takeaways from this session. But I thought all 4 of our speakers did a fantastic job of just really going to the heart of the issues and speaking to those issues eloquently, and I would just do a great disservice if I tried to even summarize the richness of the points that they made, but we have taken them all down. What I do want to do is to highlight for the audience out there 7 messages, key lessons from the book. Some of them are already covered by our 4 presenters today, and some of them are not. So let me just very quickly go through those 7 lessons that my co-editor and I drew out from the book. So the first one, probably one of the biggest takeaways from the book, is that we need to do a better job of centering and elevating African voices, African agency in peace-building processes. This particular message comes through in various chapters of the book, whether we're talking peace support operations, local peace committees, the role of religion in peace, DDR, or restorative justice and reconciliation, or even post-conflict reconstruction. Simply put, we have to ensure that African voices and knowledge are reflected in what peace means, how best to build it, and how to sustain it. So that's message number 1. The second message that we got from the book is that too often, international actors are crowding out these African voices, and that they are privileging elites over ordinary citizens. And so that there is a need to respect that African agency that is more inclusive than our current paradigm. And I think you heard a little bit about that today when we were talking about peace agreements that are crafted with the national elite, or the struggles that we've had in terms of embedding local peace committees into the larger peace building frameworks. But that this inclusion really has to also extend better to women and youth. That there's need to ensure that women and youth are in at the beginning and that they have a seat at the table. This is not to say that international actors do not have a role. We all know that international actors and partners have a critical role to play, particularly in the immediate aftermath of conflict. And I think the larger message, the larger point there is one that one of our authors, who's not an SVNP member, reminds us of, that nations are built from within and not from outside. So international partners bring value added, but the owners of the peace, the sustainers of the peace, are the local people in these African countries. The second point is that Africa has been home to numerous peace building and peace support operations over the last 30 years. And currently the continent is hosting 6 of the UN's 13 peacekeeping missions, fewer than we've had in a long time, but still struggling. And this speaks to the fragility of peace and security on the continent. And this fragility is only going to worsen in the COVID and post-COVID era. And that while the African Union has taken an increasing role in peace support operations, the United Nations still remains the single most prominent actor when it comes to peace support operations. However, the success of peace support operation is compromised by a number of factors, including the complex security situations the overly broad mandates that are often given to these peace support operation missions, the lack of prioritization of tasks, and too heavy of a focus on the size of the mission rather than the capabilities and skills that are required to fulfill the mandate. In addition, and perhaps most critically, too often peace support operations are not in sync with the larger political strategy needed to end the conflict, and that we need to do better at ensuring that peace support operations are understood as only one tool in the larger strategy, and that they by themselves, that is the peace support operations, cannot deliver or sustain peace. And this is why this disconnect between the political dimensions of peace building and the peace support missions is what has led us to situations like the DRC, where we've had a peacekeeping mission for over 20 years now. The third lesson is that peacekeeping and peace building are long-term and costly endeavors. And this is one of the points that Gustavo was talking about in his question. Yet peace building in Africa has been challenged by an overdependence on external or non-African resources, which raises a number of concerns, which is that what is pledged internationally is not always timely or directed to the areas where Africans feel it is most needed. We know that the African Union has started to build its peace fund, and this is a step in the right direction, but more is needed in this area. For as we all know, and this came out very clearly, there is a saying that goes, you cannot build peace or go to war with another man's purse. So how do we get those African resources to be the underpinning of this peace that we are trying to build? The fourth lesson is that peace building processes often include mandates for institution building and for extending the reach of the state. Yet, as one of the authors reminds us, there's need to rethink more about what kind of state are we trying to build, and therefore, how do we build peace in the context of where the state, in some cases, is actually one of the spoilers or an agent of violence against its own people, or when state institutions have been infiltrated by and are being used by non-state actors. And this speaks directly to the last point Dr. Eze made, which is that the configuration of African states through the Berlin Conference is such that these were states that were not designed to succeed, but make them succeed, we must. So what is the process that we need to undergo to ensure that we're building states that are responsive to the needs of their people? The fifth lesson, which is where we started with this presentation, with Dr. Eze's presentation, is that we need to invest more in conflict prevention. Throughout the book, you get the sense that the African Union's APSA, the African Union's African Peace and Security Architecture, is heavily skewed towards addressing conflict once it has broken out. Can we do more to listen to those early warning messages? Can we do more to respond a lot more quickly so we do not get to the point where conflict actually breaks out? So this means doing more to strengthen the norms of good governance, of inclusion, of transitional justice, of political accountability across the continent. It also means doing more, as Dr. Eze said right at the beginning of this session, to close the gap between early warning and early response. 6, and I've already talked about this, there is room to do better at including women, peace, and the security agenda. We've made some progress, but too often women are excluded, and the only door through which women enter peace processes is as part of civil society. This is not to understate the important role of civil society organizations, but women and youth have to be more centralized in peace mediation, in conflict resolution, and in peace building processes. And then 6, economic dimensions of peace building are under prioritized in peace building processes, while we favor political dimensions. Need to do more to bring those economic dimensions to the forefront. And then 7th and lastly is learning more from Africa's peace building successes. Not everything in Africa is broken. And so too often we focus on the failures and not enough on the lessons that we can draw from those things that are working well across the African continent. And so with that, let me conclude this session, which has been a truly fantastic session, by asking all of you to join us for the next session, which starts at 10:05, which is a session. We had commissioned 4 papers. We had a competition for SVNP members to co-author papers related to a peace building topic on the African continent. We assembled a committee to review the papers that we received. And in the next session, a very short session, we are going to make an announcement of who the winner of that competition was. So please join us in 4 minutes. So we'll give you a quick 4-minute break. We'll bring in the authors and the moderator for the next session, Ms. Oge, and then we will have a very short session after that. So just thank you to our speakers. You did a fantastic job. I appreciate you all, and thank you to all of you for listening in. We hope you will stay for the competition announcement.
Thank you. Good day.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding 2021 Virtual Annual Conference Session, focusing on the Southern Voices Network paper competition announcement and the 10-minute paper presentation. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I am the director of the West Africa program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP. So just briefly, for those of you for anyone who isn't familiar with USIP, we are a U.S. independent, nonpartisan national institute charged with a mission to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. We achieve our mission by linking training and analysis, research and policy, and by supporting those working on the front lines of conflict around the world. Just last year, USIP established a new Africa Center, and this decision reflected USIP's commitment to expand and transform its already considerable work in Africa. So I'm really excited to be here today to join this conversation today, because at the core of the Southern Voices Network program is generating the African peacebuilding knowledge to inform international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. As part of its mission, the Southern Voices Network program also seeks to strengthen collaboration and sharing of best practices and lessons learned about peacebuilding and state peacebuilding among Southern Voices Network members and with African and international stakeholders. To this end, the Wilson Center Africa program invited submissions of co-authored research papers involving 2 or more Southern Voices Network member organizations. The authors were asked to focus on an issue that is relevant to peacebuilding in Africa, with the option of selecting an existing issue or highlighting an emerging issue. The authors were also asked to assess current responses to the peacebuilding challenge, which they had identified, and more importantly, to offer policy options and actions that can be used to better address the issues and advance peace. The Wilson Center received 4 proposals involving more than 8 Southern Voices Network member organizations. An external committee of 3 was assembled to review the submitted papers and select the winning paper for the award. I had the honor of serving on the external review committee along with 2 colleagues and friends, Mr. Nii Akwete and Dr. Jamie Van Leeuwen. Before I move forward in announcing the winners, I would like to briefly thank each of the 4 papers. I would like to briefly talk about each of the 4 papers and the authors who submitted them, and I will do this in no particular order. The first paper is titled Rethinking Egard's Role in Addressing Emerging Regional Security Threats. This paper was submitted by Dr. Getachew Gebrekidan, Assistant Professor of Peace and Security Studies at Ethiopian Civil Service University, and Mr. Mesey Gobina, a PhD candidate in Peace and Security Studies at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, Addis Ababa University. Both are Southern Voices Network scholars, are former scholars of the Southern Voices Network program. Their paper challenges Egard's role in addressing emerging regional security threats in the Horn of Africa, as defined in its constitutive act. The second paper focuses on lessons from street protest as a peacemaking process. This paper was submitted by Dr. Arsène Brice Bardot, who is the Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Center for Research and Action for Peace, CERAP, Mr. Philippe Guillet, also at CERAP, and Dr. Ludovic Lado, the Director of the Center for Studies and Training for Development, CEFOD. The paper seeks to understand street protest in Africa as a trend we are increasingly seeing across the continent, and how it differs from similar protests, which have also signaled changes in other parts of the world, such as protests that we're also seeing here in the United States. It argues that this new form of street protest as peace building has been more effective in toppling authoritarian regimes in Africa than the measures used in previous decades. The third paper focuses on preventing and countering violent extremism in Eastern Africa in the COVID-19 era. This paper was submitted by Dr. Nicholas Ozor, the Executive Director at the African Technology Policy Studies Network, ATPS. Mr. Felix Musila, who is also at ATPS, and Professor Frederick Ogenga, who is the founding director of the Center for Media, Democracy, Peace and Security at Rongo University, Kenya. The fourth paper focuses on the EndSARS youth protest in Nigeria and explores lessons and opportunities for regional stability. This paper was submitted by Mr. Osei Bafo Frimpong, who is a researcher and conflict analyst at the West Africa Network for Peacebuilding, WANEP, and Mr. Richmond Commodore, who is a research and policy analyst at the African Center for Economic Transformation, ACET. Both of them are former Southern Voices Network scholars. This paper examines and highlights that the increasing disconnect evident among Nigeria's youth during the EndSARS protest also reflects a similar trend that we're also seeing in other West African states. And this has implications for regional security. The paper further argues that the opportunities for centering and addressing youth grievances across the sub-region in order to prevent potential threats to regional stability should be seized upon by all stakeholders. I really want to thank all the authors for these incredibly rich papers, which were all very informative and in their ways reflected trends that we're seeing across the continent and also provided options for us to look forward. Sincerely, it was very hard for the committee to make a decision because all four papers were strong, all four papers were relevant, and as I said, they provided options for us in terms of thinking about the way forward. I join all the members of the committee would like to applaud the Wilson Center for the decision to publish all four papers, as this will certainly enrich our thinking and practice about peace building in Africa. Having said that, the committee decided that there was a tie, and the winning papers were the ones on street protest and peace building, and the paper on the EndSARS youth protest in Nigeria. Congratulations to the authors of these two papers. The Wilson Center will be in contact after the conference to get your award to you. It is now my pleasure to call upon the representative of each of the winning papers to provide a 2.5-minute presentation on their paper. Again, my congratulations again to all the winners, and I thank you all, the authors. We look forward to reading the papers once they're published, and I want to turn it over to Monday and Hannah, who will call on the speakers, on the authors to give their presentations. Monday?
Thank you so much, Oge. And again, thank you to you and Nee and Jamie for taking this on. Did a fantastic job reviewing the papers and just going through them. And I know it was difficult, so we appreciate that you came to the decision that you arrived at. With that, let me quickly call on Bryce first for 2 minutes, and then I'll call on Bafo. So Bryce, can you please join us? Bryce, you're muted. Can you unmute and just speak for 2 minutes?
Okay. Good. So thank you very much. On behalf of my colleagues, Lado Ludovic and Philippe Gueux, I would like to express my gratitude to the SVNP, and especially to Dr. Monde and to the entire team of the Africa program at the Wilson Center. So the title of our paper is Lesson Learned from street protests as a peacemaking process. As you have seen across the continent, African people have challenged the government to demand better functioning democracies and improve socioeconomic conditions, as were the cases of Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Burkina Faso, Gambia, Sudan, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. This has led to the rise of contentious politics with a lot of demonstrations, strikes, riot, and even military mutinies, which has transformed the street into a site of protest and peace building. This paper argues that peace building scholars and practitioners must take the street seriously as a locus for peace building, for building peace, and develop new strategies that are adapted to the streets where critical citizens challenge the government and demand for change. There exists an important literature on popular culture, music, theater, sport, art, etc., as a way of protest and resistance against oppression. There is also abundant literature on street demonstration as a mechanism for peace building, especially in the USA with the civil rights movement. However, the street protests and street peace builders that we have witnessed in recent years in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Burkina Faso, Gambia, Sudan, and Cote d'Ivoire seem to be different from what happened on other continents. African scholars and policymakers involved in peace building must capture the spirit and the rationale behind these street protests that are more effective in toppling authoritarian regimes than military coups, and finally to restore peace. Understanding the rationale of the street protests and their contribution to peace in Africa will help to strengthen peace building mechanism in a manner that is more contextualized to Africa. So this paper aims therefore to understand the rise of street peace builders in Africa by striving to answer to the following critical question. What do we really know? What do we know on street builders? To answer to this question, first the paper analyzes the factors
Bryce,
of the emergence. Yes.
Sorry, Bryce, I'm going to ask you to just conclude because we have to give 2 minutes to Osei, then we have to move on to the next session. So just in 1 minute, please conclude.
Okay, thank you. So what we try to say, we just, when we analyze this protests in 7 countries, and then we try to highlight the lesson that we learned. So we concluded by suggesting recommendations that were inspired by the lesson learned. So what we try to say is that is simply to say that street have become a very important place for peace building, that we have to learn, we have to try to understand the lesson that these peace builders on the street have tried to tell us. So I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we appreciate you. We congratulate you and your colleagues. We do have to get to the next session. So let me just turn it over to Bafo to speak on behalf of his co-author, and then we'll bring the session to a close.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monde. The central focus of our paper was that we decided to reflect on the EndSARS protest, which occurred in Nigeria at the peak of the global pandemic. Obviously, the protest attracted traction across the international community and also much support from transnational agencies and actors. But our argument was that were the issues that triggered EndSARS only limited to Nigeria? Certainly not. And therefore, EndSARS is a reflection of a wider socio-economic challenges facing the West African states, particularly young people. Issues such as unemployment, poverty, and lack of inclusivity in the governance systems in the country, which has contributed in marginalizing young people from participating in the governance across the sub-region. And therefore, EndSARS is not only a Nigerian problem, but rather a problem across the West African sub-region. So it presents lessons in the first place addressing governance fault lines, which over the years have contributed in marginalizing the youth and impoverishing them. And our argument number 2 is that if we fail as states or as a sub-region to address these issues, we will continue to have instability across the sub-region. So what do we propose? Number 1 is to centralize or let the youth be at the nerve center of our governance and development in terms of formulating policies and implementing those policies to enhance the socio-economic livelihood of young people across the sub-region, because they constitute over 70% of our population. Our population is one of the youngest throughout the world. And therefore, if we fail to bring the issues confronting the youth on board across the sub-region, we will definitely have challenges. So this is the key message that our paper seeks to bring to the fore to policymakers' attention. Thank you very much, Dr. Monde.
Thank you, Bafo, and congratulations again. Okay, let me turn it over to you to just close us. Oh, do you have any words for us, or we're just moving into the next session? I think we're moving into the next session, right? Sorry, you're muted.
To get myself off mute. No, we are moving into the next session, but I really want to again, join you once again in congratulating all the authors of this paper. Very interesting recommendations, and really looking forward to reading all these papers once they are published, as they will continue to enrich our understanding on peace building in Africa. I just want to remind everyone that there is also an internal Southern Voices Network session that is starting in 15 minutes. And we invite everyone else to join us again tomorrow for the last day of the annual conference. Tomorrow's sessions will include a session on COVID-19, security and peace building, non-state actors and international stakeholders from 8:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and a session focusing on beyond silencing the guns, reflection on challenges and recommendations for the way forward from 10:30 to noon Eastern Time. So I will stop there and turn it back to you all, but please everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Olge, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this session. I forgot to plug the SVNP book, so here it is. It is open access, which means you don't have to pay for it. You can find the link on our website, so please do take a look and please do enjoy it. And we'll see for the general public, we hope to see you tomorrow For my SVNP colleagues, we are starting the next session, which is an internal session in 5 minutes. So please grab a quick cup of tea, coffee, or whatever you need to sustain you through the next period. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next session. For the public, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.